Order. Will you please call the roll?
Commissioner Cardoza?
Here.
Commissioner Donaldson?
Here.
Commissioner Coomerly?
Here.
Here. Commissioner Sherman?
Here.
Commissioner Steinberg?
Present.
I believe Vice Chair Flores will be here shortly. Commissioner
No,
Hoff?
he's not going to be here.
Oh, he's not coming tonight?
I was told he was out of town till Monday.
Oh, all right. Then he has an excused absence. I guess I forgot about that. Okay. And Commissioner Hoff, Chair Hoff.
Here.
So
Please join me in the Pledge of Allegiance.
Allegiance to the flag of the United States of America, and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
We're honored to have two new commissioners with us tonight. Well, first of all, I want to thank John for agreeing to reserve another 3 years. Some people are glutton for punishment.
My pleasure.
And he's one of them. Will the director please introduce our two commissioners?
Certainly, I'd be happy to. We have Vanessa Coomerly, who lives on Ocean Avenue and is currently the chair of the Zoning Update Steering Committee, and I sure has many other sterling credentials that she can tell us about. And Stephen Steinberg, who is a new resident at the Glass House Project on 65th Street and is an architect with Ratcliffe Architects. Oh, I neglected to mention that Commissioner Coomerly has her own landscape design business as well. So perhaps the new commissioners would care to say a few words about themselves.
Thank you very much. We're looking forward to a very successful 3-year term. Will the city clerk please swear in the new commissioners?
Art,
Huh?
they were going to say something.
Who?
Two new commissioners.
I thought they would do it after they become official commissioners.
Oh,
Excuse
Fair
me.
enough.
Okay. So, yes, the city clerk will now administer the oath of office to our two new planning commissioners.
Yes, I've given each of the new commissioners a copy of the oath of loyalty to the state of California's Constitution and the laws therein. And if you would stand up and we just read the oath. You just read it. You don't have to repeat after me.
Together?
Together, yes.
Ready?
ready.
I,
I, Vanessa
Stephen
Coomerly,
Steinberg,
do solemnly swear
Sorry.
that I will support
that I will support and defend the Constitution of the United States and the Constitution of the State of California against all enemies, foreign and domestic, that I will bear true faith and allegiance to the Constitution of the United States and the Constitution of the State of California, that I take this obligation freely without any mental reservation or purpose of evasion, and that I will well and faithfully discharge the duties upon which I am about to enter.
Great. So if you will please sign that, and I will give you a copy. And welcome to the Planning Commission.
Thank you.
Now, if you care to say something, you're free to do so. Anything, but you can't resign.
This is a very exciting chapter in my life. I look forward to spending a lot of time in Emeryville, hopefully the rest of my career and life here, since my wife and I have taken this as our favorite place to be. And I hope to really safeguard the development and future growth of this community so that it's done in a very sensitive manner that is respectful of all citizens. And I will do my darndest to be impartial and fair in everything I review as a team member with these esteemed members. Thank you.
One thing I neglected to mention is that Commissioner Steinberg was formerly a member of the Planning Commission and the chair of the Planning Commission in Scottsdale, Arizona.
Well, that's good credentials.
And I'm very honored to have been chosen to be on the Planning Commission, and am also looking forward to doing my utmost and my best in upholding Emeryville's excellence in design and in its growth and development. And I look forward. There's some big shoes to fill with both Jim and Patty being gone, and I look forward to the steep learning curve and more fun and exciting.
Well, thank you so much. I welcome you to the commission, and I'm very impressed with your backgrounds, and I'm sure that you'll have a lot to contribute to our deliberations. The next item on the agenda is the election of officers. The first will be the chairman. Do we have any nominations?
I nominate Frank Flores.
I nominate John Sherman.
Can we have two nominations?
Well, we can. I think we need a second for each one, though.
Is there a second for the Flores nomination?
I would second Frank Flores.
Okay. All right.
Thanks, Gabriel.
Is there a second for,
Well, I think John has been expressing his
So-
reluctance to be a chair, so I'm not
you're
going
with-
to,
you're
I
gonna
can't
with-
second
you're-
myself
you're
anyway.
withdrawing your motion.
Yeah.
So it's been first and seconded that Frank Flores would be chairman of the commission. Is there any questions, any discussion? If not, call the roll, please.
All right. Commissioner Cardoza,
Aye.
Commissioner Donaldson, Commissioner Kummerly,
Aye.
Commissioner Sherman,
Aye.
Commissioner Steinberg,
Aye.
Chair Hoff.
Aye.
6 ayes, so Commissioner Flores is elected chair. However, he is not here, so whoever you elect as vice chair will preside tonight.
And I'd like to make a motion asserting my authority to nominate Buzz Cardoza as the vice chair, one of our longest-serving commissioner, and he's been avoiding this responsibility for some time. So I think it's time that he step up to the plate.
I would second that.
Do you second that? Any discussion? Please call the roll.
Commissioner Cardoza?
Can I vote?
Sure.
Aye.
Commissioner Donaldson?
Aye.
Commissioner Kummerly?
Aye.
Commissioner Sherman?
Aye.
Commissioner Steinberg?
Aye.
And Commissioner Hoff.
Aye, Commissioner. So at this point, I assume we turn this over to
To
our
the
new
chair.
vice chairman.
Yes.
You want to come over here?
Guess I have to, don't I? The next order of business will be public comment. Do we have any members of the public who'd like to speak on an item that's not on the agenda this evening?
On an item that's not on the agenda.
Right.
Okay. I wanted to say something about the zoning ordinance.
That'll come in a little while.
Okay.
That provided the, yeah, okay. Action recap. Do we have a motion to approve?
I have one amendment to the minutes, to the action recap. It is on page 5, and it is one of Commissioner Martin's comments regarding the proposed IKEA project. The minutes say the customer and delivery entries should be switched, and I believe that Commissioner Martin's point was that employee parking would be appropriate on the 53rd Street side, and that both delivery and customers should be on the south side of the building.
I think that's right, yeah.
Okay.
Are there any other corrections or comments?
I would move approval as corrected.
I'll second it.
Are there, all in favor?
Excuse
Do
me.
we have to take a roll call?
No, I just, I didn't get the, Commissioner Donaldson moved, and who seconded? Hoff? Oh, okay. You can do this by acclamation, however, I think it would be appropriate for the two new commissioners to abstain.
Right.
So that would be
We have four people, I
four
guess.
ayes, 2 abstentions, 1 absent. Okay.
Next item is director's report.
Okay. fairly brief tonight. I want to tell you about what the City Council has done since your last meeting. They've only had one meeting because they take a break in the beginning of July. So their last meeting was just this past Tuesday on the 20th. They heard a report on the status of the zoning update. They also approved the contract with Alta Planning and Design for the new pedestrian bicycle plan. Work on that will be getting underway shortly. As you probably know, the VII.A, the Bicycle Pedestrian Advisory Committee, is serving as the steering committee for that effort, and the first meeting with them as the steering committee will be on Monday, September 13th. The council introduced an ordinance which will reduce the building permit fees for solar panel installations, and there's a companion resolution amending the master fee schedule for that. The final passage of the ordinance will be on August 3rd to take effect September 2nd, and sometime in August we will bring to the council a resolution amending the master fee schedule to reflect those lower fees for solar panels. The council finally approved the 2009-2014 housing element as revised, which you heard at your last meeting. That will now be sent to the State Department of Housing and Community Development within the next few days for certification, which they have told us they will do this time. So hopefully we're finally at the end of that long road. And finally, the council approved a permanent residential permit parking area on Beaudry Street, north of 59th, the east side, and on the north side of 59th between Beaudry and Vallejo. This is in place of a temporary permit area that had been there when the Anna Yates School was in the Ralph Hawley site. So that permit parking area will now be permanent. The Zoning Update Steering Committee continues to work on the new zoning ordinance. Their next meeting is on August 24th, and at that meeting they will hear a status report on the progress of the new zoning ordinance, including a new draft zoning map, a list of the new zones, a list of new use classifications and definitions, and the beginnings of a matrix indicating which uses would be permitted or conditionally permitted in each zone. So other than the item listed on your agenda, which is discussion of the September Planning Commission retreat, that concludes my director's report. I'd be happy to respond to any questions you may have, and after that we can go on to the retreat discussion.
Any further questions?
Okay. Well, the Planning Commission bylaws call for you to hold a retreat every year in September. We didn't do it last year, mainly because all of our efforts at that time were going towards getting the new general plan adopted, which, of course, as you know, did happen in October. But 2 years ago, on September 27th, the Commission held a retreat which consisted of a bus tour of completed projects in Emeryville, recently completed projects, a kind of a lessons learned tour, which the Commission had done also in the past. The idea being to look at projects that you have approved that have recently been completed and see how they turned out, and if they turned out the way you thought they would, or if there were surprises or things that in retrospect you wish you had done differently. I think it's a good idea to go back and look at things you have approved and see how they turned out. And the bus tour 2 years ago also included a number of projects in Oakland. At that time, a desire was expressed to also include some projects in Berkeley, but the tour as it was already pretty lengthy, and so it was decided that Berkeley was probably too much to include 2 years ago. However, it was suggested that the next time we do this, maybe we should go to Berkeley. So staff would suggest that you do another bus tour of recently approved projects or recently completed projects in Emeryville, and then also include a loop through Berkeley to look at some of the things that are going on there. I would like to suggest as a date Saturday, September 25th. 2 years ago, the tour was from 9 a.m. to 2 p.m., which seemed to be a workable period of time. And some of the sites that I would suggest visiting in Emeryville that have been recently completed would include Age Song, Oak Walk, Adeline Place, and the Flatiron Building, which are adjacent to each other, West Elm Furniture, and Doyle Hollis Park, and perhaps also some new projects in Berkeley. And certainly this is your decision, so if that date doesn't work or those times don't work, or you want to do something completely different from what staff is suggesting, that's your prerogative.
Any comments?
I think that the last bus tour was really useful. I enjoyed it and I learned a lot, and I think I think that that's a good thing to do. I think that last year, the last time we did it, actually 9 to 2 was a bit too long. I think people
Okay.
started falling off towards the end, and it would be good to keep it a little bit shorter.
Okay.
I'd like to see the projects in Emeryville, and I think probably Berkeley might be more manageable than the route that we took around Oakland, which was pretty extensive.
So 9
And
to
the
1?
date works for me.
And one of the things that I'd like to see maybe rolled into this, maybe just a half-hour discussion, is maybe have a little dialogue on how we might have more effective study sessions. One of the things that I've kind of observed is that we make a lot of comments, and I'm not sure there's consensus, and I'm not sure that we give clear direction to people. And I think there are things that we could possibly do to improve that. So I'd like to just spend about a half hour and just discuss some ways that we could make that better.
Okay.
Would the Berkeley portion be in the city of Berkeley, focused in the campus? Because I know it'll be in full swing at that point of the year. It might be pretty hectic getting
Well,
a bus through there.
It'll be on a Saturday, and I wasn't really intending to go to the university, but more to look at some of the new projects that have been built recently in the downtown area and along University Avenue and along San Pablo Avenue, and there are a number of interesting new buildings in Berkeley. So
It's pre-football season, so it shouldn't be too bad.
hopefully.
Okay.
John, was your comment concerning how we handle applicants at a study session where we're all giving out multiple comments? And because
Right, I'm not sure that we, at the end of the meeting.
that's
that-
I want to reinforce that, because I've had the same feeling. An applicant comes in here and he hears multiple comments from different people, and he doesn't know which are important and which are not. I mean, is that the view of a single commissioner, or is it the view of many commissioners? That would be important to them. So I've often thought that there ought to be some way, like when we did the general plan review, we made each commissioner vote on each idea and say, well, do you agree with this? If not, we'll pass, and we went on to the next one. So we had a consensus opinion on each item that was discussed. And maybe, would that be more of your thinking?
It is, and I think we can do some brainstorming on ideas like that. But that's exactly the issue that,
Yeah, and I
that
agree
I've
with you
observed.
because if I were an applicant, I'd be confused.
right, very much.
2 years ago, we started at Christie Avenue Park, and we also ended at Christie Avenue Park, where I think we had lunch. People got their lunches at the marketplace and then came and ate it at the park. I'd like to suggest that this year, since it's finished now, that we start and end at Doyle Hollis Park. I'm not sure if that lends itself to discussion like you're suggesting, but I think it's probably doable. There are picnic tables there, and we can figure out a way to sit around and talk. Obviously, the public is invited to these meetings as well, because I mean it is a planning commission meeting, so it will be open to anyone in the public who wants to attend.
I think it would be fine, but I think the staff ought to come up with some recommendations of a format that will deal with our problem.
Format, you mean concerning study sessions?
Yeah. As part of the study session.
We can give some thought to that, but we would be interested in hearing,
I
your
can give you some
brainstorm.
ideas. that I-
Should we
Okay.
give you some suggestions about places in Berkeley to look at?
Absolutely. If you have any now, that's fine, or you can just send me an email or give me a
The,
call.
the new Trader Joe's, I think, is one of them.
That
I'd
was
like
on
to-
our list for sure. So I'm hearing that you are interested in doing a bus tour. Should make it a little shorter than the last one. Is 9 to 1 a workable time frame?
Yeah,
Okay.
it's time for discussion.
Right. That's the thing, is we have to be sure that we include some time for discussion. We usually would end with lunch.
We
could
talk
try.
over lunch.
We could talk over lunch.
Perfect.
Right. We could consider ordering lunch for everybody, if you'd like us to do that. That's probably, actually, that'd be better than
Sounds
having
like a good
everybody run
use of
off to a
time.
cafe and come back.
Yep.
Okay.
Would we have some descriptions of all the sites we're going to look at in advance so that we can formulate some?
Yeah,
Some
we'll
concepts,
put
ideas?
together a packet for you. Last time, I think what we did was most of these buildings have their own websites, so we just went to the websites of each of these buildings and kind of printed out the web pages. So we can do that ahead of time. Yeah. Okay, and the date of September, what did I say, 25th? Is that okay with everybody?
Yes.
All right. All right, well, that concludes the director's report.
Okay, next section is public hearings. The first item is the design guidelines.
Good evening, Vice Chair Cardoza and members of the Commission. Deborah Diamond from Planning Staff.
Thank you.
And very pleased to be here tonight to present you with the draft design guidelines for the City of Emeryville. This is a kind of a tag team presentation. I'd like to introduce Jeannie Eisberg, who is going to be helping me. Jeannie is with the consulting firm of VII.A and has been the principal author and putter together of the design guidelines, working very closely with the steering committee on this. So tonight we'll have a presentation with Jeannie and myself, and then I'll provide some introductory comments, and then Jeannie will walk you through each of the sections of the design guidelines. This is a public hearing item, and after the public hearing, we're recommending that the Planning Commission take action on the design guidelines. And just to provide some context for the guidelines, in 2004, the City of Emeryville embarked on updating its zoning regulations and established the General Plan and Zoning Update Steering Committee. And then in 2005, the consulting firm of VII.A was brought in, and the scope of their work included kind of three major things. One is, of course, the update of the General Plan, which was completed last year. Also to update the zoning ordinance to be in conformance with the general plan, and just because it needs updating anyway. And that effort is in progress, being overseen by the now Zoning Update Steering Committee, and also to develop these design guidelines. Just because I thought you might be interested, I provided a little like this, which has highlighted what our current zoning regulation has in terms of design guidelines. So there are a few guidelines in the zoning regulations, but as you can see, they're minimal, and I think that what we're proposing will be a vast improvement on what we have. Urban design has been one of the key themes that the General Plan and Zoning Update Steering Committee focused on, and has been a strong focus from the beginning. Not every city has an urban design element to their general plan, but because it was deemed important for Emeryville, we do have an urban design element that provides kind of the policy basis for Emeryville's urban form. And then I'd like to say a little bit about the steering committee's work on this. The steering committee started working on the design guidelines in 2008, and this was kind of in concert with the development of the general plan. And throughout the steering committee's work with the design guidelines, they've been subject to much public review over the last several years. So at this point, I'm going to turn the presentation over to Jeannie. She's going to walk you through the design guidelines, and then I'll be back.
Hi, good evening. As Deborah mentioned, I'm Jeannie Iceberg with VII.A, and I'm just going to walk you through the design guidelines. So if you want to flip along with me, we'll be going in order. So Chapter 1 basically lays out the purpose and intent of the design guidelines. Oops, I hit the wrong one. And so the purpose is really to implement the general plan. This is one of the major tools that we have to do that. And we're really here translating urban design policies into specific guidance for urban design. Second, these are advisory recommendations when applicants come in to give them a sense of what the city's intent is, what you're really looking for to drive their development process. And then third, to assist you in evaluating projects along with the city council. And the intent here, we're trying to strike a balance for these to be prescriptive enough that they really provide a framework for design, but also allow room for flexibility and creativity in the design process. And this little graphic gives, sort of oversimplifies, but gives an understanding of how it fits into the context. So Deborah mentioned the scope of work here in terms of the general plan, the zoning ordinance, and the design guidelines. And basically, the guiding principles in the general plan, 10 of them, are really the heart and the spirit of the general plan. And they express the community's vision. All the goals and policies in the general plan build off of these principles. So that second circle, the urban design policies, provides a greater level of detail. And then the design guidelines and zoning ordinance, this is where we really start to supplement the design guidelines supplement the objective standards in the zoning ordinance with more qualitative direction. So they provide a broader illustration and interpretation of individual standards and examples for how project applicants can meet the requirements and the intent of the city's vision. So you'll see there are not a lot of numbers in this document. In the zoning ordinance, you'll see more of the standards, the setback depths, the side yards, and those will be identified at that time. And Michael Diet from our office has been working, he's reviewed these design guidelines, he's been involved in their development, so he understands the direction that we're going when we get to the point of the steering committee and then later you reviewing the zoning ordinance. So moving along into Chapter 2, this is the general guidelines. So these would apply to all sites in Emeryville regardless of land use type or building type or location. So sidewalk guidelines consider the interface between private development and the public realm to create a pedestrian-scaled experience. This diagram describes this concept of segmenting the sidewalk into 3 parts, providing public space at the building entry, a clear pedestrian pathway, and room for landscaping and street furniture near the curb. And with the steering committee, we ended up going into more detail on this one, recommending at least 6 feet of unobstructed pathway in the eastern residential neighborhoods and 7.5 feet in all other areas. Similarly, for the landscaping area, recommending 3 feet width minimum in the eastern residential neighborhoods and a minimum of 4 feet in other areas of the city. Landscaping guidelines seek to provide distinction, a unified appearance through the selection of appropriate tree species, generous planting strips that follow the city's stormwater guidelines for green dense redevelopment, and the bay-friendly landscaping guidelines. Parking and access guidelines seek to provide adequate and convenient parking and loading areas while minimizing their visibility. So this can be achieved by designing parking below grade, but also integrating parking structures within the building design as shown in the photo on the right from Mountain View. So to prevent conflicts between vehicles and pedestrians and cyclists, the guidelines seek to limit curb cuts, provide safe, accessible entrances to parking areas, and situate loading zones away from pedestrian walkways. Site planning guidelines encourage sunlight, views, accessibility, and energy efficiency in the siting of buildings and projects, as well as the 3-dimensionality of buildings, so that the backs of buildings are well designed, like in this bridge court example on the left. Guidelines address siting for passive and active solar gain, designing plazas and open spaces that are visible and accessible, screening refuse bins, and concealing mechanical equipment. They also discuss the street wall, which represents the collective appearance of multiple entrances and buildings along the sidewalk. Massing guidelines seek to define a skyline that supports pleasant, safe, and sunlit streets and sidewalks. Bulky buildings, like in this diagram on the top left, can cast large shadows, obstruct sunlight and views. A building or series of buildings that are slender, tiered, or varied in height and shape permit light and air to pass through, allow views, and create visually interesting skylines. This can be achieved by defining a distinguishable base, middle, and top for all buildings of 5 stories or more. And this is particularly important in areas, transition areas like North Hollis, where you see a stepping down in building heights. The building form and articulation guidelines seek to respect Emeryville's history, existing neighborhood character, maximize visual interest and visibility, and balance privacy and safety to ensure pedestrian orientation. Articulation guidelines recommend 3-dimensional elements, balconies, recesses, windows, variation in floor levels, facades, materials, and colors to break up the appearance of larger buildings. This section also includes guidelines for green roofs to manage stormwater runoff and reduce energy consumption through insulation. The guidelines don't specify any architectural style. Rather, they try to encourage and are adaptable to a range of styles. This could be encouraging creativity through integrating public art, colors, details, window treatments, proportions. This section also contains guidelines on sustainable building design, water-saving measures, efficient lighting, and it also has a section on interior building lighting, integrating it into the facade. Building materials and colors are particularly effective in establishing continuity, but also variety in design and quality within a development or among adjacent buildings. The guidelines encourage durable and attractive building materials, colors, and details. They recommend sustainable building materials and building practices, including diverting waste from landfills, promoting reduction, reuse, and recycling during construction. In terms of private open space, the guidelines seek to enhance quality of life for residents. These areas may be very small, but should be adequately sized to allow movement and usability. They should balance privacy and safety with air and sunlight access. In terms of common open spaces, they should be designed as an integrated element of the project. Site planning should define an enclosed open space to ensure that some portion of units or commercial spaces overlook the common area. Roof terraces and green roofs could be used to fulfill common open space requirements as long as they're usable and accessible. The guidelines recommend that publicly accessible open spaces be located along the east, west, or southern block faces, where feasible to maximize sun exposure. Landscaping should be drought resistant, require minimal maintenance and irrigation, and certainly be consistent with the Bay-friendly landscaping principles. Open spaces should be wind protected, physically and perceptively accessible from public streets, and permit a variety of activities, have ample seating, and sufficient lighting. These sign guidelines, together with the sign standards contained in the zoning ordinance, ensure that signage adds to the city's identity and does not overwhelm or detract from the public realm, particularly along pedestrian-oriented streets. Signs should be designed as integral design element of a building's architecture and appropriate for the district or neighborhood context. They should be readable, unambiguous, concise, so that the viewer can understand what appears on the sign and recognize it from a reasonable distance. So Chapter 3, which includes area-specific building type and street types, supplement the general guidelines, providing guidance that is only applicable to specific general plan designations, building or use types, or street types. So these guidelines are unique to each category and do not reiterate the general guidelines that we just addressed. Regional retail overlay guidelines ensure that large retail and mixed-use sites support multimodal access. They seek to create pedestrian-oriented projects that ensure the safety and comfort of all users by locating active uses directly adjacent to and facing streets, maximizing windows and retail areas, and providing wide sidewalks and pedestrian facilities. Guidelines for the neighborhood retail overlay areas and the neighborhood centers seek to foster street vibrancy, enhance the neighborhood quality of life. The majority of ground floor use and a substantial portion of the frontage along any public street should be devoted to active commercial uses, stores, offices, flex spaces that serve the local community. And where appropriate, we want to see outdoor dining, parks, and plazas should be included to provide activity and gathering spaces. Where necessary, security screens are at least partially transparent are permitted, but the opaque roll-down gates are strongly discouraged. So in the eastern residential neighborhoods, this area is not expected to change substantially in coming years, but so new development really should be the existing structures, the neighborhood character through height, massing, sloped roofs. Parking should be located where it has the least visual and physical impact on the streets. But in general, while improvements are being made, renovations, this is an opportunity to enhance the neighborhood through improved landscaping, sidewalks, and overall streetscapes. The pedestrian priority zones highlight areas where pedestrian safety and movement is the top priority. This is around transit stations, neighborhood centers, and schools. And these zones are characterized by wide sidewalks, outdoor seating, active uses on the ground floor, consistent landscaping, street furniture, bulb outs, plazas, public art, things like that. The gateways denote the key entrances to the city where specifically designated landmark elements should be focused. Gateways should incorporate unique designs, be visible to both motorists and pedestrians, and really emblematic of the city's cultural and historic identity. So this could include streetscape features, public art, signage, wayfinding, lightings, particular pavers, to create a sense of entry and acknowledgement of the city's character. Greenways and green streets are envisioned as landscaped green oases. That's what we called them in the general plan. So they offer opportunities for strolling, lingering, sitting, jogging, but also provide environmental benefits through stormwater management. So the city already has many good examples, like in this photo, of how buildings can interface with the greenway to promote use and safety. The guidelines recommend public-oriented uses at the ground level, workshops, lobbies, common areas. Where residential uses are located on the greenway, we recommend stairs, stoops, or other architectural features which contribute to the pedestrian life. Green streets should provide generous sidewalks, consistent street tree plantings, and cohesive streetscape improvements. 2 transit hubs are identified in the city. These are transfer points where high-volume transit lines intersect, so at the Amtrak station and at 40th and San Pablo. And in these locations, we recommend building entrances oriented to provide convenient access to transit, active uses, retail, restaurants, located so they're visible to transit users. So with Emeryville's exceptional accessibility to freeways and the rail line come potential impacts, particularly noise, air quality, obstructed views, and disruptions to vehicle and pedestrian mobility. So careful site planning and building design can help to reduce these impacts. In general, buildings directly adjacent to a freeway or railway should not contain residential uses. If they do, the residential portion of the building should be set back away from the freeway, buffered with landscaping, screening, open space, or off-street parking to provide a visual barrier. Buildings should provide sound and vibration insulation. Windows should include screens to reduce dust and particulate from entering, and units that directly face the freeway should be mechanically ventilated or provide comfortable temperatures and noise attenuation through some other means. So moving into building types, in mixed-use developments, we recommend windows should be designed to highlight the uses within, storefront windows at the street level, smaller windows in residential areas on upper floors to allow privacy. The primary entrances for both first-floor establishments and upper levels should be within the primary facade and visible and accessible from the street. Retail buildings should have articulated building facades with a combination of windows, entries, bays, variation in facades at the ground level. Shallow recesses and entryways are encouraged to create the appearance of several smaller buildings or shops rather than a single large and monotonous building. Large big box retail should provide variation in the facade and roof lines. This example of the Old Navy is from Alameda. Loading, storage, and equipment areas should be screened or well integrated into the building. Stores should accommodate pedestrian and vehicle traffic as well and bicycle traffic by constructing entries from the public street. Industrial guidelines encourage landscaping to buffer visual impacts and changes in use, particularly in transition zones between commercial or industrial and residential uses. Window design and ground floor entries should maximize pedestrian safety and visibility, and noise should be controlled at the source where feasible. For industrial uses no longer in use, new uses should seek to adaptively reuse buildings to maintain the style and character of those districts. Civic buildings should be designed with prominent entrances through architectural and landscape features, tower elements, canopies, columns, recesses. Building entries should be oriented towards the street, and street and plaza-facing facades should be lined with windows to promote transparency. Office guidelines encourage vertical building elements, taller floor-to-ceiling heights on the first floor, changes in materials and finishes to break up generally much larger buildings and enable flexibility for potential future uses. The base of the building facing the street should accommodate retail and other non-office uses where feasible. Housing should be designed for a range of household types, incomes, and sizes. This was a policy in the general plan promoting family-oriented housing. Design should maximize sunlight, privacy, and ventilation, take advantage of views and natural light, particularly in living areas. Buildings should provide visual interest and improve quality of life for inhabitants through the use of stoops, porches, recessed windows, bay windows, balconies, and family-oriented units should be located on lower floors to maximize accessibility, parents looking at kids on the street playing in the courtyard. Landscaping, lighting, and changes in planes should be employed to ensure privacy and safety. In these examples, a portion of ground level frontage of multifamily residential units are townhomes and flats on the left with individual or paired entrances from the street. On the right, we have articulated ground floor to express a more rhythm of individual units along the street, even though it's one large building. The last section is on street types, and this is the circulation map from the general plan. So these guidelines provide for each street types several guidelines. So as sites are being developed or redeveloped, builders can consider the type of street that they're on in their design for the sidewalk or public area. Local streets prioritize safety and ensure low vehicle speeds through traffic calming measures. Connector streets, which accommodate moderate to high traffic volumes, prioritize pedestrian crossings at intersections. Auto-dominant highways are the freeways and on and off ramp areas which don't always allow pedestrians. So the guidelines here seek to ensure that pedestrian safety, where you transition to city streets near the MacArthur off-ramps, you have a community garden, where these coincide with gateway entrances to the city, they should be designed consistent with those guidelines. So last, the various bike designations. Oh, thank you. Coughing attack. So the various bike designations seek to ensure continuous flow of bicyclists, improve signage, traffic calming, and to slow vehicle traffic. And lastly, transit streets provide transit service, recommends signal preemption, shelters, benches, and lighting at bus stops. And I'm going to pass it. The last one. Here we go. Back to Deborah.
Thank you, Jeannie. So just two more slides. One, this is the CEQA slide. And you're being asked to consider adoption of a planning document, and planning documents are generally subject to environmental review. However, an environmental impact report was adopted for the general plan, and the design guidelines implement the general plan. The guidelines will result in no additional significant environmental impacts, and therefore no additional environmental review is required. So in terms of a recommendation, this is a public hearing item. We're asking that you open and close the public hearing. Nobody here. But, and then staff is recommending that the Planning Commission approve the Emeryville design guidelines and forward them to the City Council with a recommendation for adoption. And Jeannie and I are here to answer any questions that you may have. Thank you.
Does anyone have any questions?
I actually have a couple of questions. One is that at one point the plan says that the city is going to establish a unified planting palette. Are we in process of getting a street tree plan, or is there
My
something actually
understanding is
happening
that
with
we
that?
actually do have one that we are implementing from the Public Works Department. They have one, and they have a palette that they use when they do street plantings.
Okay.
And I'm not aware of any other plan afoot to do anything more than that.
Okay. That's the only question I had right now. I think I
Have any questions?
Sure. Is there a need for developments of a certain size and scale and character to submit scale models?
Yes, and we do see scale models when we have projects coming forward, and generally larger projects, but somebody who does more project review can answer that better.
It's not a requirement, but sometimes applicants will do that to help visualize what a project looks like. What we typically do on a large project that requires environmental review is visual simulations, computer simulations. Those are from specific vantage points. And of course, often the developers will do their own as well. But
Good.
it's not an absolute requirement at this point.
Could it be encouraged in the design guidelines for a certain scale? For instance, the marketplace development, which is multi-phased, it's very hard to grasp the overall concept if you look at one isolated phase without it in context. And it's good for everybody to be able to appreciate the phasing and the character study.
That it could be. I'm not sure that the design guidelines are necessarily the correct place to put that, though. I think I might
Submittal requirements?
might put it in the list of submittal requirements.
As far as connectivity is very important in the design guidelines, connectivity, pedestrian connectivity from district to district. It seems that there's not enough discussion on the edges and zoning edges and district edges and how they should transition from one to the other. Did I miss that, or is that something we could embellish perhaps?
Well, what would you be looking for in terms of how we're treating the edges?
From
Just-
landscaping to material palette to massing, how we respect
So
the transition, the edges from district to district, unless we're trying to create which I don't think we are, a homogeneous look, but it.
Mhm. Yeah, address that,
See,
Dana.
right now, there are some in the industrial section that talk about transitions there. We don't have anything in any of the other sections. And the general plan talks a little bit about transitions in terms of height, and similarly here in the building massing, where we talk about transitioning into lower height districts. But it's really about heights and landscaping, more of it as a screening, attenuating noise.
Okay. Also, where would I find right-of-way street cross-sections in the design guidelines, or would they be in a different, in the zoning ordinance for specific information on dimensions for the different types of streets and cross-sections?
This is something we talked about with the steering committee. Where does this belong? The design guidelines really started as a document about the private development space. So it does get into the sidewalk, and we ended up adding on that street types section. There are some sections in here, they're a little bit more, there are not so many hard numbers in there. We have those minimum pedestrian unobstructed pathways, but we don't have street sections for those streets types here, nor in the general plan. I don't know if the bike and ped plan going forward may have something, but these are new street types for the general plan. These aren't the standard street types.
As far as art, public art, I see mention of it, I just don't see any examples of what's preferred and encouraged graphically or pictorially. I don't see any real examples in here so that we can encourage more public art.
The city does have a public art program, and there are criteria and procedures for how public art is created and installed. And there, I believe there's policies supporting public art in the general plan as well. But in terms of specifics, you're correct. There aren't specifics here. And we felt that the city's existing public art program covered that.
In addition, there is a city council appointed public art committee which administers the public art program. And they are the ones who are charged with making the decisions about what public art would be installed and what wouldn't be installed. And given the existing program that's in place and the existing committee that's in place to oversee that program, we didn't want to go too far in the planning regulations and guidelines in dictating what that art would be.
Not dictate what it would be, but maybe should encourage what it could look like based on some good examples in other cities, perhaps. The placement of sculpture in public plazas, entryways to major developments. I mean, I don't see that much artwork in Emeryville, and it's an artist community, and I'm hoping that changes.
We have a
It's-
map that shows where all the public art is. Maybe you might have to go out of your way to find it.
It's
But-
not as apparent as I would love it to be, since I'm an art
Also a
lover.
percentage of the total construction budget that has to be
On private projects, yeah, 1%
1%.
has to be for art.
5%, isn't
1%
it? 1%.
of
Yeah.
construction valuation.
Yeah, for instance, at Glass House, the art piece is the porte cochere, so to speak, the canopy.
Right.
And most people pass that and don't realize that's art, public art.
Well, that's the
unfortunately.
thing, is you may not be aware of the public art that's around because it may not be obvious. At City Hall, for example, the front and back doors are
Mhm.
public art,
Right.
and the fountain
And the sculpture here. And
back is public art. These?
the glass sculpture.
Oh,
and the-
yes, I'm sorry, yes,
and the-
those solar rows.
Yeah.
Yes, right, I go by it every day, I've just gotten sort of used to it.
And one last question, as far as sustainability, could there not be a chapter devoted to sustainability as opposed to just weaving it throughout the entire design guidelines, so that somebody can go to a chapter and a checklist and really understand how they can incorporate sustainability
Yes.
holistically into their project?
Right. The state of California requires that there be 7 elements of a general plan, but jurisdictions can add some. And so City of Emeryville added an urban design element, but also a sustainability element. So the general plan has a lot on sustainability, and it's actually kind of the sustainability element is kind of a compendium of all the sustainable efforts that have been taking place in Emeryville and all the sustainable policies that are in place. So that's where you look for sustainability.
Okay, thank you.
Could you go to your very first slide, the purpose?
Should we do this when we have our discussion?
Well, this is kind of it's kind of on the lines of Stephen's question about the street. And it's kind of like what's appropriate to be in this document and what's not appropriate to be in the document.
Go to a particular slide. I'll start over here.
Because I'm struggling kind of with the street sections on whether this is the appropriate place to have them or if it's not. And one of the things that really strikes me is number 2, assist project applicants during the project design phase. And being a person that does design, my best projects are where people are really clear about what their intentions are. And I can look at their basis of design kind of things and say, this is what we want. The projects that I struggle with the most are the ones where people don't tell me what they want. And I almost feel like we're missing an opportunity here. And we've done a really good job in the general plan on our street types and saying, you know, we want green streets, we want this type of street, we want the retail areas. I don't know that we've done a good enough job of defining those, and you know, especially the cross sections of the streets. And then if you could just go to your, I think it's like 1 or 2 slides in, where you talk about the context. Keep going. It was a really nice slide.
Am I going backwards?
It was the blue, kind of like the, there we go. And so here's where I'm just kind of struggling with this document, whether this is the appropriate place for some things, or if the zoning ordinance standards or the bike ped plan are the appropriate place, and maybe I'm being, you know, looking for too much detail in a document that's not a detailed document. And so basically some of the problems that I see that I'm trying to resolve are like on the greenways, we've got really inconsistent, or especially green streets, greenways. The greenway on the peninsula, the path is all kinds of different widths. The latest segment that they just put in is really wonderful. It's an 8.5 foot wide width. But I don't see anything anywhere that says in the future we'd like any additions, any changes to the paths to be 8.5 feet. If we're in a high volume area, a high pedestrian volume area on our green street, I think that that should have a wider sidewalk width than what the minimum is. But again, I don't know that this is the appropriate place for that. And if I can just give you a couple things that maybe you can put on the overhead, some people can take a quick look. And another problem area I see is like Bay Street. I think the sidewalks are really too small. So this is, I just got this like hot off the press today. I got an email with San Francisco's, not even sure what it's called, Better Streets Plan. So this is a plan, and I'm not sure if the plan is that like the next step down into the details, but they had a very similar type thing where they have their park edge streets and then they have another type of street, and they do the sections that kind of make it really clear to people this is what we're envisioning this to be. If you can just maybe go to the next one there. Here's another example of that. Mm-hmm. So there's a Parkway Street, and that has a different section, different sidewalk width. And then if you can go to the next one, next page. This is from our Park Avenue District Plan, and what this tells me is that we had a very clear vision of what we wanted in the plan. It was really clear, and we got what we were looking for. You can go to the next. And then these are just some examples of different sidewalk widths along the green streets, greenways, where the top picture is like 10 foot, the second picture is 8.5 foot, the bottom picture, which is on a green street, is 8 feet. And, you know, I'm not sure, I don't know what the magic number is. I just know that I'd like to see some sort of consistency, something that says, you're on a green street or you're on this corridor. We really encourage the pedestrian traffic, and there's some consistent theme here with the plantings of the trees, the sidewalks, that says this is the main pedestrian thoroughfare. And I think I've got one last thing possibly. Yeah, and this was just, so again, going back to what my concern is, whereas going through Bay Street, I don't feel comfortable there. I don't think the sidewalks are adequate. I went down to Santana Row, and there's significant difference and a significantly different feel to it. So this is what I'd like to achieve. I just don't know where to put which document that this belongs in. And if it belongs in this document, then maybe this needs to be updated. If it doesn't belong in this document, then we should define that. And just one other comment on that is, when I read through here, at the very beginning of this section 2, it says sidewalk and curb standards in the urban forestry ordinance can be found in Title 7, Public Works of the Emeryville Municipal Code. So I went to the website to see if I could find that, to see what does that give me the detail, the sections that I'm looking for. And I kind of came into a dead end. I couldn't find any of that information. You know, that might just be a website thing, but it just kind of, to me, this stuff really needs to be visible so that developers, architects can look at a very few documents, get the picture, and say, this is what we need to do. This is the vision that we're trying to achieve. So.
I can say something about this. As Jeannie said, this document is mainly intended for private developments or developments that are off the street. They're not all private. I mean, some of them are public projects, like the fire station, for example, but not within the public right-of-way. And So in that, and as Deborah explained, these are intended to be used mainly through our design review process when the commission or staff or the city council is doing design review on a new project. This would help us to determine whether the project was appropriately designed or not. To that extent, we often ask developers or require developers to do public improvements, especially sidewalks, street trees, curb gutter, things like that. We don't typically ask them to rebuild an entire street from one side to the other. So we felt that including details about travel lane widths and things like that didn't seem to be appropriate in here, because we would rarely, if ever, ask, that would rarely, if ever, come up in design review. Sidewalk treatment, on the other hand, often comes up in design review. So we felt that it was appropriate to include things about sidewalks in here. As you know, the dimensions that are now included on page 8 of 6-foot wide minimum sidewalk in the eastern residential areas and 7.5-foot wide minimum sidewalk everywhere else in the city was your suggestion at the Zoning Update Steering Committee. And what I'm hearing, I think, is that you'd like to take that one step further with more detail and perhaps different widths on different types of streets. And I would say, in my opinion, that would be appropriate. It would give the developers a level of certainty, a level of detail of what they are expected to do. It would give staff and the commission and the council a clear idea of what is expected. And it seems to me that if the commission wants to do that and wants to go that direction, this would be an appropriate document to do that in. If you are going to do that, I would suggest that you continue this to a future meeting and let us, rework it a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
I would support that, because I think it's really important information, and I think it has come up in front of us a number of times, most recently with the marketplace, the building that was proposed, where it was felt by the commissioners, I was recused, but that some of the sidewalks were just too small, and there was nothing to point to and say, we want a 7-foot sidewalk or an 8-foot sidewalk, or under these circumstances it should be thus. So I would support John's direction on that.
I would point out that it's not citywide, but in a couple of the existing overlay areas there are some standards. They're not at that level of detail quite, but in the North Hollis area, for example, buildings are required to be set back 15 feet from the curb, regardless of where the property line may be, so that you get an effective 15-foot sidewalk width. And you can really see the effect that has had, especially at, for example, the Glass House project. And there are similar kinds of guidelines for sidewalk width in the Park Avenue district, but these things don't apply throughout the city.
I'm a little confused. I thought we had established a criteria that sidewalks would have an unobstructed 7.5 feet in non-residential areas, and what, 6 feet? Well, why do you want to go beyond that?
Because I think there are different areas, and we have the different street types, and I think that the 7.5 foot is a minimum, and that's a huge step forward from where we're at today.
But it seems to me if you start getting these things in too fine detail, I think it's counterproductive. Why can't we review these things at the commission level and saying that that's just not adequate for this area?
Because it's too subjective, and I've run into that where I've thought a sidewalk was totally inadequate, and many of the commissioners thought, oh, it's fine.
Well, I think being somewhat subjective is good and not making it too cut and dry.
Well, I think there are minimums, and I think certainly in our retail districts,
you're going to make everything so cut and dry that there'll be no need for a planning commission, and I object to that.
Vice Chair Cardoza?
I think if you give general guidelines,
Can we just calm down a bit? Actually, we're supposed to open a public hearing here, and then we have our discussion.
Right, that was going to be my point. Thank you.
So I'd like to now open the public hearing. Are there any public members that would like to speak? close the public hearing, and now we'll consider the Emeryville design guidelines. And staff, I hope, will stay to answer questions.
They're not going anywhere.
So, Art, I'm sorry to interrupt.
No, I think I made my point. I'm in favor of more general guidelines, subject to review. I mean, it was obvious when this last project came before us that 4.5-foot sidewalk was not acceptable. And we told them so. But I don't see to lay out in each area the width of, because conditions can change in different areas. Some buildings may already be set back way from the street, so the width of the sidewalk may not be as important. You know, I just.
Well, I think the width of the sidewalk is always important, and that's kind of my point.
No, but I'm saying,
I think it gets
I'm saying
undervalued.
if there's space on the private land that augments it, that's a good trade-off.
That's where we're getting, to me, far too subjective on what that trade-off is.
Well, it's just, anyway, that's my point of view.
Gail, did you want to say something?
I think that it is a good idea to get a little bit more specific, because the types of places where we're going to want to see a broader sidewalk and more public space are the types of large developments where you would want to require the building to be set back from the right-of-way in order to create that kind of public space. And I think that that's
I
appropriate.
don't understand. We've been working on this planning commission, these guidelines for over a year. All of you participated in all of those things, and I thought we were agreed on this was the proper plan. Now you're saying you're having a change of mind and you want to start over again.
No, I've actually brought up the idea of having street sections at every
But
steering.
you weren't concurred with at that level.
Well, I'm not sure that I wasn't actually.
Well, why isn't it in the plan?
I don't know.
I think my belief is it's overkill.
If I could, I'll just remind the commission of what is currently in the general plan itself. This is in the urban design element of the general plan. Now, there are no dimensions on here, which I think is Commissioner Sherman's point. It does say widened sidewalks with enhanced landscaping. And then this is for a key green street. Typical cross-section shows bike lanes, travel lanes, sidewalks, street trees, and so forth. And then there's a similar section for neighborhood centers. Talks about what kind of treatments should be there. But as you can see, the right-of-way varies, and none of the dimensions of the sidewalk or the planting strip or the travel lanes are called out here. There are also not similar sections for other street types. So this is what you have now.
And don't you feel that if a developer came to you and said with a 3-foot sidewalk, wouldn't the staff tell him right up front, this is not going to be acceptable
Well,
at the staff review level?
at this point, we tell them that it has to be at least 7.5 feet.
I think there has to be a
Okay.
minimum standard.
Well, we have a minimum standard.
And, you know, further than that, it's difficult to.
Yeah, okay.
In effect, you're giving private property to a public body if you encroach on their property.
That's true.
And my biggest issue has been the description of signage. I lived for most of my adult life in a community in Los Angeles that had a specific plan for their main boulevard that required front-lit signs. And it was implemented over a long period of time because there were a lot of backlit signs already there. But it made an enormous difference in the feeling of the community. And you can go to places like Carmel or Aspen where they only allow front-lit signs. And I think it gives a much nicer feel to the street, particularly at night. And I'd like to see some parts of the city adopt these standards, because I think it would make a big difference. but I don't know if this is the place where that should go or not.
Well, as an architect, you'd go to the design guidelines as a starting point. So I think it's really important to have some guidelines. They should be somewhat flexible, depending on the exact circumstance, but they need a starting point, and the guideline would be the starting point, and it is minimum standard. They can
But-
always get better.
I sat on the design review board for this specific plan, and we had chain restaurants come in who were incensed about not being allowed to put up their standard sign. But, yeah, but we held our position, and their businesses did not suffer.
There is right now being developed as part of the zoning update, a pretty extensive and fairly detailed section on sign standards, with the types of lighting, the sizes relative to the building, that, all of that kind of stuff. I'm not sure what would be in the design guidelines document that would not be covered in that.
I think that the regulations on signs that have been drafted have gone through the zoning update steering committee review, and I don't have them with me, so I can't say, but I know there is some limitation on the lighting of signs. You can't have the cabinet signs or box signs that are internally lit, but I can't remember the specifics, so.
So nothing specific has been done about it?
No, there are a proposal moving forward as part of the zoning update in terms of the control of all signs, the regulations for all signs.
And those, of course, will be coming to the Planning Commission for your review and recommendation before they get adopted by the City Council.
Okay.
Well, I have a number of very specific comments, but it seems like there is still the question sort of sitting out there whether we would be continuing this or whether we're looking at adopting it right now. Should we make a decision on
Why
that?
don't we get some more, I think Val wants to make some.
I also have some more specific comments, and I'm feeling like we need to resolve the broader question first, or do we delve into details? Thoughts?
Well, I don't know the answer to that.
My personal view is that we have spent over a year on this project. We've had peer review after peer review. I can't remember how many meetings we've sat through. It's not a perfect document, but I think it's a good guideline, and I'd like to see us adopt it and move forward tonight. That's my view.
Well, may I suggest that each commissioner make their comments, and then after you all have heard everybody else's comments, you can decide what course of action you want to take?
That's fine. It was just, I had the feeling that someone wanted to know ahead of time.
Well, I'll go ahead with my comments then. Most all of them were wonderfully incorporated, most all of my previous comments, during the meetings that we had about the draft with the steering committee. However, there were a few things that got missed, and a couple of them I feel are important enough to mention here. On page 14 of the site planning C, I don't see any mention of buffering of noise from mechanical equipment in the site planning phase, and maybe that is somewhere in the general plan, but I think it's very important. Also, in site planning, the consideration of wind studies for taller buildings, rooftop parks and plazas, and their impact on the site plan, I think, is not mentioned, and I feel like this might be the right place for that.
So just to be clear, on site planning, we have guidelines C-5, which is about screening of mechanical equipment, but you're talking about buffering in terms of the noise?
Yes.
Page 57 talks about noise a little bit from an industrial source. J11. I don't know if that's what you meant.
It does.
But it could
does.
be any mechanical equipment on it could be generator on any type of building. So we could add that to,
It just, it
C
seems like it's a
five.
general, the auditory quality of our environment is pretty important.
and then the wind protection ended up in the open space guidelines, so this is,
Page is that?
While they're looking for that, I would just like to add about noise from mechanical equipment. Within the general plan itself, there is a policy, CSNP 57 on page 6-31 in the conservation, safety, and noise element. It says the city shall require noise buffering, dampening, or active cancellation on rooftop or other outdoor mechanical equipment located near residences, parks, and other noise-sensitive land uses. And there are some other policies also about noise and noise reduction.
I guess this does bring up a broader point also, which Stephen and John and everyone has been talking about, that when an architect is going to plan a building, they not only need these design guidelines, but they need to be directed to look carefully at the signage and the general plan, and I'm sure they will be. Just maybe there needs to be a mention of that in design guidelines in the beginning. I don't know.
so getting back to the wind, so the wind protection is not discussed in site planning, but it is discussed twice in the open space. So on page 33, in publicly accessible open space, guideline G-17 talks about planning for the open space in terms of sun access, but also protecting from winds, which are typically westerly.
You also
Well-
have it on page 32 as far as common open space, but there's a couple of other places where I was noting that it should be mentioned, and maybe in site design as well.
And then on page 30, which is private open space, or maybe that's what you're referring to. Private open space in G-2, it talks about wind protection there too.
Yeah, it's in
But-
all the open space ones.
But if you're talking about site planning for, not necessarily for public open spaces, but for
Buildings
buildings.
and
in
their
terms of-
impact, once we start getting larger buildings in the inner core there, and their impact on wind. Yeah. Okay.
both their impact on wind and their protection from, as people are entering and exiting the building.
Yes. The other one is on page 42, I-10, the second bullet. I just don't like the way it's written. Design new homes that are taller than existing adjacent homes with sloped roofs to create a transition between heights. Seems like it's directing folks to design taller houses. And I would prefer to see something along the lines of use sloped roofs to create transition in heights between new home designs that are taller than existing adjacent homes. Since it has been such an issue for the Planning Commission, heights of homes, I think that might be a good little tweak.
Okay.
And do believe that's it.
Did you have more comments, Gail?
I had a couple of specific ones. One was that in an earlier version of the design guidelines, we had encouraged mid-block pedestrian access, and I don't remember that being taken out of this one by discussion. Do you remember?
No, I don't remember that.
Because the
taken
earlier
out.
one says, on sites over 1 acre, improve pedestrian connectivity by providing mid-block public pedestrian and/or bicycle paths where feasible. This will break up the super blocks and allow for more pedestrian-oriented spaces and view corridors. And I don't remember that being taken out, so.
I know it's in the plan itself, as a policy.
The general plan?
I thought we used to have more street grid in here, and it was redundant with the general plan, so it might have gotten.
It
it's
used to
not
be,
in the-
used to
it's
be
a
on
phantom
page
change.
8. It would be on page 11.
There's an example on page 10 of a mid-block.
Yeah. Yeah, the
Situation,
example is still
Palo
there,
Alto.
but the
But the guideline
reference
itself
to it
isn't
is
there?
not.
Mm-hmm.
Well, there was a project that did come before us. I think it was a coffee warehouse adjacent to the artist co-op. And the people who live in the artist co-op, Pete's Coffee, and the people who live in the artist co-op did not want it because it gave access to the side of their property. And they'd had trouble with break-ins there. And so, you know, I think it could be made as a suggestion, but not as a positive requirement.
Well, okay, so this wouldn't be a requirement, it would be a recommendation, but I know we do have that policy in the plan, so we could add it into the site planning section as a
I think in the Pete's
guideline.
situation, the property was dedicated to the city, but it wasn't constructed.
But I think that's a really important policy to have.
Yeah.
Because we talk so much about breaking up the mega blocks, and that's one
Yeah.
of the things that we want to do better.
Right.
The general plan has this pedestrian system map in the transportation chapter, which you have to kind of study it, but if you look at it closely, you'll see that there are quite a few mid-block connections that are called for here. This is the one at Pete's that you were talking about. Another one in this block. There's several in the Triangle neighborhood. There's some around here, and others up here and here, various places in the city. If something is shown in the general plan, then it's supposed to be done. So any project that comes along that's on any of these places where these paths are shown, we make them put that path in. So I'm not sure you need to say it in the design guidelines unless you want some additional paths beyond what's shown in the general plan.
I don't think it would hurt to have an additional mention of it, because that, if you're starting out on a project, you're gonna look at the documents. You may not be looking at the pedestrian system, because it might not occur to you that you need to look at a pedestrian system if you're, doing a development anyway.
So we can locate that guideline that we had before, but basically I think it does build off of the general plan policies, P20 and 23, which talk about those internal connections on larger parcels. And then the zoning ordinance can define what a large parcel is,
Mm-hmm.
what a super block is.
Anyway, I'd like to see that added. There's, on page 14, where it's talking about screening the refuse bins and waste containers, I think we should be making reference to screening and covering in an architecturally compatible manner, covering because of the stormwater pollution issues with trash locations, especially for larger buildings. Bear with me for a moment. There's a few copy editing things that I can pass on later. And there was another wind protection in talking about creating public spaces in retail on page 56. The last bullet on the page in J7 it talks about providing sun and shade protection, sun exposure, but it needs wind protection as well.
Okay, so this is one of those issues, if we want to put it as a general guideline in site planning, so regardless of building type, versus we couldn't also put it, or instead we can put it here, that it's really most important in these retail areas where you have people gathering. But otherwise, if we cover it in the general guidelines, is that enough? Or do we want to put it in multiple?
I think it's just another comma and say
Okay.
wind protection
Easy.
there, and it doesn't hurt to put it
Okay.
in. And the one other thing is on page 51, talking about the transit hubs. It just needs clarification where it's shown on the map that we're talking about a 5-minute walk or a quarter-mile walk, because we're talking about the transit hubs, and it's identifying them as these specific locations, but the types of things that we're asking people to do extend out to the quarter mile. So that's just a clarification point. And I have a couple of other just minor copy editing things which I can pass on later and won't take time with now. Oh, except for page 40, where we're talking about the opaque roll-down doors, which I would like to say they're prohibited in the neighborhood centers. I can see them in some of the other areas. That they're strongly discouraged is great, but opaque roll-down doors seem really inappropriate in the neighborhood center areas. That's my list for now.
40.
40.
So my comments on page 8 and 9. Page 9, the lower left-hand corner, the desirable picture. I think that the text that's there conflicts with the text that's on the previous page, and I think it was valid when the sidewalk widths were 6 foot, but the wording doesn't work right. And I think the intent is there, that you can use some part of your tree grate, a minimal part of your tree grate, as sidewalk in certain circumstances. I would just change the text or drop the part of the text that talks about the 6 foot, because that conflicts with a 7.5 foot minimum. Then on page 14, along the site planning guidelines, kind of on the same vein as Vanessa's comment, I had a citizen that brought to my attention this mechanical screening on roofs, and I think that this talks about, it doesn't specifically talk about stuff on roofs, and later in one of the other sections we talk about buildings that are above 5 floors, then we talk about mechanical screening, but I can think of like the BRE office building that's right next to Paul Street, that doesn't have any screening. It's all a single-story building. So I think any rooftop mechanical equipment needs to be screened. And my personal preference is that mechanical spaces should be a penthouse versus screening. And I don't know if it's appropriate to say the preferred is to have a mechanical penthouse, and this maybe gets into all kinds of height issues too. So I'm just kind of brainstorming here, but if I would rather see a mechanical penthouse be built that totally shields all the mechanical equipment and not consider that penthouse as the building height, so it's not penalizing the structure for height.
Well, that's usually the case anyway, isn't it?
Concerning the height of mechanical equipment on the tops of buildings, that's not included in the height limit. Such things are allowed under the zoning ordinance to go 10 feet above the height limit, and if they need to go higher than that, that can be done with a conditional use permit. So it would be part of the commission's review to look at those mechanical areas. I would note, though, that I'm certainly not an expert in this area, but my understanding is that the mechanical equipment that's on the roof of a building, even if it's within a penthouse area, still has to be open to the sky in order to be properly vented.
No, they can bring in the outside air from the side vents and everything.
Well, okay.
Probably the only case would be like cooling towers, but like a lot of the fan systems and
Okay, well, I don't know. Again, I'm, not an expert in that area, so I don't know that for a fact. But I think you're going to be looking down at this stuff, even if it's screened from view from the street. So my personal opinion is that to require total screening of all HVAC equipment on every single building is a bit draconian. And I think maybe we need to be more circumspect about how much it's required and how much is not required.
I disagree on that, and I'm just going from my experience of working on buildings all over the Bay Area, and it's a pretty common requirement to have screening around buildings, even if it's a 1 or a 2-story building.
Around them, but I'm saying totally enclosed.
Oh no,
on
not
the
totally.
top. That's what
No.
I'm saying.
Yeah, right.
Oh yeah, screening on the sides, absolutely.
Okay.
But to totally enclose
No.
every HVAC thing on every building, I think that's what I'm saying is draconian.
I would agree with that. I would say it's a preferred, but it's a,
Since you live in the top of the tallest building in the East Bay, you look down on all that stuff.
well, I
John's going to see all of them.
But I
wherever
think
they are.
there are 5-story buildings that look down on single-story buildings that see ugly mechanical equipment on the roof. So on page 38, when we're into the area-specific guidelines, and this might be an area where we could be general in terms of sidewalks and say, wider sidewalks than the minimum are encouraged, or something like that, if we don't have the sections that give more guidance on that. That there's kind of similar wording to that in other places. And then on page 49, when we talk about the greenways and green streets, again, if we're not going to have sections, then maybe we should have something that says, in high pedestrian traffic areas, wider sidewalks are encouraged. And small correction on page 65, on the Bike Boulevard illustration, there's a 6-foot width that should be now 7.5. But that's basically it. And I also just wanted to say thanks to the zoning committee for all the time and effort that they put into this, because it's really evolved into something that I think has gotten pretty good.
Well, what is the action we should do now, Charlie?
Well, I guess that depends on.
It sounds like we need to continue it,
Has everyone weighed
work on
in?
it a little bit.
One more here.
Has
I mean,
everyone weighed in with their comments?
I had a few, but I think I broached most of them. The ones that I just wanted to be clear about was on page 65, adding minimum dimensions to the bicycle lane graphics. And that pertains also to the right-of-way street cross-sections, which I think are missing on page 63. It needs to be embellished a little bit to give guidance to developers and architects. On page 29, it mentions high-quality durable materials. And I don't know if we can discourage the use of synthetic stucco, but it looks like every building in the area that I live in is undergoing reconstruction because of it's probably poor workmanship, but it's also the material itself, which a lot of architectural firms are banning from use. And ours is one of them. We're not using drive-in anymore, synthetic stucco, because it's just not holding up in this environment. I wonder if we can encourage not using that material on page 29 where we mention high-quality durable materials. And my last comment refers to signage, page 36. I know we have a signage ordinance which is being worked on right now, but is there any way that the signage ordinance could also avoid the temporary signage we see at Bay Street, which is so horrible? Yeah, garish, horrible, and then that Chevron station, which has a lot of window signs, which I think overcomes some of the ordinance requirements, and they do a lot of signage on their own. I wonder if the signage ordinance, which is not, I'm not saying that should be in the design guidelines, but Charlie, is the signage ordinance that's being developed now more stringent as far as window signage and other forms of signage that we see at the Chevron station?
Well, let me begin by saying that not every sign that you see in Emeryville is legal.
Right.
or conforming to the codes. Given our resources, we don't have the ability to go out and do code enforcement on every property in the city, but we do enforce the codes on a complaint-driven basis. So there are criteria about window signs and how large they're supposed to be and so forth, and there may be places that exceed that, but they haven't come in to ask for permission. So some of these things you see may not be, it may not be the code that's the problem. Concerning the temporary signs at Bay Street, I'm not sure which ones you're referring to.
It's in the design guidelines. It shows a picture on page 36,
Oh. Page 36.
which says, well, it's a whole discourse there. Ignoring your need to shop. It's kind of poetic,
Oh.
but
Oh,
it's in lieu of a dock store, or a store under construction.
right. Okay,
Okay.
I see what you're talking about. I wanted to clarify what you were saying about, where was that? Page, where was that? You mentioned about dimensions of streets.
Right.
Page 65?
65 refers to the bicycle lane graphic.
Mm-hmm. The bike boulevard graphic?
65. Let me see. Yeah. In the cross section, there are no suggested dimensions minimum.
Right, because as I think I previously indicated, these guidelines are intended mainly for private development, and they typically wouldn't be building these things. Bicycle facilities, in particular, are governed by state Caltrans standards, and they have very detailed criteria for how wide a bike lane has to be. They don't have any standards for bicycle boulevards. Typically, a bicycle boulevard is on a street that is just a street with travel lanes, which typically are at least a minimum of 10 feet wide. So we didn't try to define Class 1, Class 2, Class 3 bike facilities in here because they're already defined by Caltrans.
Okay.
Well, I would say that the commission has a couple of choices here. You can do what the steering committee did and trust staff to take all your comments under advisement and approve it for forwarding to the city council with all the comments you've made tonight, assuming there's consensus on those comments. Or you could choose to continue it to a future commission meeting, directing us to make the revisions you've requested, bring it back for another look-see, make sure that, we got it all right. In either case, I think, though, that you do need to decide whether or not you want to include the more detailed sidewalk dimensions that Commissioner Sherman is requesting. And if you do want to do that, I would request that you give us direction on exactly what standards you're looking for. Not necessarily the numbers, but which street types do you want us to include to have standards in this document?
Would it be possible for the staff to put together all the proposals that have been made today and come back at the next meeting, or does this slow the whole process down too much?
Well, there's not a real rush on these design guidelines. Frankly, the staff was a little surprised when the steering committee passed these at its last meeting. We were expecting it to come back to the steering committee for further discussion. So it's actually at the commission sooner than we expected it to be. And it's intended to be a companion to the new zoning ordinance. And the new zoning ordinance, isn't anywhere near ready to be adopted. That doesn't mean that we can't start using these new design guidelines right away as soon as they're adopted under the existing zoning ordinance. That's fine. But as I say, there isn't a big hurry. I would like to suggest, though, if you want to bring them back, due to staff vacations and other workload issues, that we put it over to the September meeting instead of the August meeting.
Is that all right with everyone?
I think that's a good idea.
Yeah.
And Charlie, one other question. I assume the general plan and the design guidelines are complementary to one another?
Absolutely.
So which one is more stringent?
Well, I think that diagram that Jeannie showed reflects that. The general plan is by nature general. It's the most general. However, it's also everything must conform to the general plan. You can't not conform to the general plan. Design guidelines are somewhat more specific than the general plan, but they're not as hard and fast as the general plan. It's possible to deviate from design guidelines and still approve a project. You're not violating the general plan if you don't follow the design guidelines to the letter. The zoning ordinance, of course, is the most specific and the most prescriptive.
Right. And this is why I think the design guidelines need some direction as far as graphical representation, sidewalk, cross sections, with some minimum dimensions as a guide, because they're not found elsewhere.
Beyond just the 7.5 feet and 6 feet.
Right, I saw
The
that.
more detailed things that Commissioner Sherman is suggesting.
Mhm.
Yeah, I would expect to see more detail on the regional retail overlay area, on the neighborhood centers, on the green streets, the pedestrian priority zones, perhaps.
Well,
Yeah, I would agree with all of those, and maybe not specifically on the pedestrian priority zones,
Yeah, those
because
sort of cross
there's
through different areas.
there's overlap,
Yeah.
and if we hit those three, the neighborhood zones, the regional retail, and the green streets / greenways, I think that would make a world of difference.
Do we have a copy of what Commissioner Sherman showed tonight?
You're welcome to.
Yeah, that'd be great if we could have that. Okay.
I had one more. I had one more that I had marked as a typo that wasn't really a typo. That was on page 12, talking about parking. Would love to add one more bullet about encouraging active uses on the ground floor of parking structures. There's one place where it says encapsulate parking in a structure, but I would like to add a bullet saying encourage street level active use.
So just to be clear on the sections, we're looking at sections for the regional retail, neighborhood center / neighborhood overlays, and the greenways, green streets. And these are sidewalk sections. We're not looking at travel lane widths or bike lane widths, which we've established are Caltrans and other specifics. So it's really just the
I'd say from
sidewalk.
the face of building to the curb,
Yeah.
right?
Okay.
Okay, well, we will attempt to do our best to incorporate all the comments that the commission has made tonight and bring it back to you in September for another look. You've already closed the public hearing, so you won't have to do that again. We'll bring it back as old business.
And I want to say, even with all these comments, they look really good.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, the next item on the agenda is zoning ordinance amendment regarding city council approval for demolition of residential structures.
I'm going to handle this one. As the commission may recall, 4 years ago in 2006, following a recommendation from the Planning Commission, the City Council adopted a new article to the zoning ordinance, Article 65, demolition of residential structures. This provides that before a structure that contains residential units can be demolished, moved, or removed, the applicant must first obtain city council approval. So no matter how big the project is, if it involves removal of residential units, it has to go to the council for approval following a recommendation from the Planning Commission. A concurrent amendment was made to the building code of the city of Emeryville, which precludes the building official from issuing a demolition permit for an existing building that has residential units until the building permit for the replacement structure was ready to be issued. And of course, the intent of that was so that we wouldn't end up with vacant lots where applicants would get their projects approved and pull a demolition permit, demolish the building, and then not build the replacement structure. Recently, the City Council had a request before it for an extension of a project, which is the 2-unit project on Ocean Avenue. That project is still alive, and the applicant is hoping to get a building permit for it within the next year or two, but wasn't ready to yet. So he had to go, and that project had come through the Planning Commission following this process, went to the City Council for approval, so the extensions had to come from the City Council. The council was willing to grant the extension. However, the existing house that's on the property, they felt was blighted, and it's vacant, and they wanted it torn down. So they made it a condition, or they attempted to make it a condition of their extension, that the house be torn down immediately. Staff advised the council that unfortunately they couldn't do that because the code that they had adopted says we cannot issue that demolition permit until the permit for the replacement structure is ready to be issued. So the council directed us to fix this, to amend the code so that under these kinds of circumstances, a demolition permit could be issued. So what you have before you is a proposed ordinance that would amend both Title IX of the Municipal Code, which is the zoning ordinance, and Title VIII, which is the building code. The amendment to Title IX would be to add an additional finding to the findings that the council has to make for approval of a residential demolition, a project involving residential demolition, and that finding is that the council finds the demolition or removal of the existing structure is in the best interest of the public health, welfare, or safety. And then the companion amendment to Title VIII would allow the building official to go ahead and issue that demolition permit in cases where the Planning Commission has made that finding. So that is the proposal before you tonight, and our recommendation is that you approve it and forward it to the City Council with a recommendation that it be adopted.
The next item would then be open the public hearing. Are there anybody who wishes to speak on this matter?
I do have questions. Well, I could
let's
do that after.
handle with the discussion.
Okay.
Yeah, my name is Keith Bodwee, and I live at 1254 Ocean, next door to the property that you guys are talking about. I've been down here before.
Can you talk more directly into the mic?
Yeah.
So we can pick you up on-
Lift it up.
I've been down here before. Some of you look familiar, and I'm against this exception to the rule, and living next door to that property, I didn't really prepare anything to say. I have particular feelings about the guy who's developing the property. I think he's known in the community, and I think if you know anything at all about him, you'll know that he's had some real kind of shady dealings, to say the least, in other communities, and he has bought the house with the intention of, or at least he represented to us that he was going to rehab the property, and he was concerned about the neighborhood and the character of the neighborhood, and he has let the property fall into blight. He's been a landlord and absentee. I would find it very disconcerting if the city would make an exception for someone who's been so neglectful and so inconsiderate of the property and the community in general, that there would be an exception made for him to kind of run willy-nilly over our community as a developer and just kind of at will do what he wants to do. I'll also say that living on Ocean Avenue, it's a tough place to live. It's unfortunate that we don't have the insularity of being kind of locked into the residential area, like houses that are a few blocks further south of us. So we're right on that border where huge development is encroaching, and particularly the north side of Ocean Avenue it's like a house of cards. We have Ali Islami's property, we have Andre's property, and it's really a tough place to be, and it's really sad. And I just feel like the blob's coming, and it's this encroaching mass of stuff. It's just like Pac-Man. It's going to eat us, and I really love where I live, and I don't think, aside from how I feel or emotionally, I don't think it seems like this dispensation that would be made, and it seems like, I didn't understand it, it's really particular to this project. It just seems like the wrong thing to do. I mean, this is truly a person who has no regard for our neighborhood or our community, and as someone who's really invested in being there and loves being there and wants to stay there, I hope that you would consider these things and that you would really take into account the division between the developed kind of condo areas and the residential areas.
Finish.
So
3 minutes or up.
So I mean, that's really all I have to say. So just wanted to come down and let you know that we do care.
Thank you very much.
I have a question for the staff. I gather this,
I'll close the public hearing now.
okay, go ahead. Is it closed?
Close.
Sorry. I gather this ordinance it's not for this property specific. It generally allows the city council to demolish any building that's blighted. Do they have to make a specific finding in the case of each building?
Yes, they would need to do that.
So this would come before the council for a specific finding.
Before us too, I believe.
Does it come before us as well?
Right. Comes before the commission for a recommendation and then to the council for adoption. The impetus for it was this building on Ocean Avenue, but it's a citywide ordinance.
Right.
It would apply in any case where the council felt that
So the
existing
gentleman
building
who
was
spoke
blighted.
would have the opportunity to come before us when this building comes up for specific action.
And before the city council.
It won't come back to us because this action is originating with the city council.
Yes, if the ordinance is adopted, the existing provisions in Article 65 provide that before the city council makes its findings and its decision as to whether or not to approve the demolition, prior to that, the application has to come to the Planning Commission, and the Planning Commission would then forward their recommendation on the demolition issue to the City Council. And so then at the Planning Commission hearing, members of the public would then have an opportunity to comment on the Planning Commission's recommendation.
So
They
even
would
though
all-
it's an extension?
They would also have an opportunity to comment at the city council, again, at that public hearing.
And the
This
city
is a
council
little-
could override the planning commission's decision.
Absolutely. This is a bit of an anomaly, this particular situation, because this came up in the context of an extension request. The original application came before the Planning Commission for recommendation to the council, and then the council approved the application. However, the extension request does not go to the commission first. It just goes straight to the council.
I thought this
But-
one did come to us, and we demanded that they clean up the property because it was kind of a mess.
Not the extension request.
Or wasn't?
It might have been in conjunction with the original approval where you said that. But in this case, this is a new finding that didn't exist before. When the project was approved initially, this finding didn't exist. So I guess even though it's an extension request, it probably would need to come back to the commission if this finding is proposed.
If at that time, at a hearing, the city decides that the building, rather than being demolished, should be well maintained, can we enforce the improvement and maintaining of a building?
Yes, the municipal code has other provisions for property maintenance and code enforcement.
So that would be an alternate for
That's
the,
also a
for
possibility,
the planning
yes.
commission and the council to consider at that time.
That's right.
I'd like to make a comment. I feel that this does not need to be addressed in law, that this is a good zoning ordinance, and it keeps the homeowner from demolishing the building and without any further plans. So, for instance, with this 1258 Ocean project, you know, if there is a mechanism to enforce the property owner to maintain the property. If they're not maintaining the property, then what would be the mechanism to get them to actually build a new one once it's demolished? It seems to be, if they're not paying attention to what needs to be done to keep the property in good maintenance, then who's to say they're going to do anything once it's torn down? And once it's torn down, we have nothing but an empty lot. And at that point, the project could be abandoned, sold, or left to sit. There's a lot of other properties in Emeryville that are sitting, and if it's sold with a house on it, even if it's a house in poor condition, I believe it would be worth more than an empty lot. So I think
financially, or in terms of the community.
In terms of the community, I think that it's the responsibility of the property owner to maintain the property, and if they're not doing that, how are we to? Why are we changing the zoning?
Well, we have dozens of properties right in that neighborhood that are very poorly maintained.
I'd like to, I think the proper response is not to look at this individual building, but I would assume there's got to be a situation where a building is in such bad condition and on the verge of falling down that any reasonable person will say that it cannot be rehabilitated and it's a danger to the community, and even in that case, we would not be able to issue a demolition permit. So it seems to me that this ordinance is important, but it has to be judiciously administered and not just a carefree attitude. Because as I say, I believe there's a situation where we all agree that building should be torn down. And so therefore, I would think we should go along with this.
Wouldn't the building department determine that and condemn the building through a legal process? Would the building department do that if a building was impacting the life and safety and welfare of the inhabitants or the neighbors? Wouldn't they take action?
They haven't
Michael?
really done that, I don't believe, in the history of the city. There's an awful lot of rundown, derelict properties.
People are still living in there.
Some are, some aren't.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, Mr. Harpio's property is one that's generated a lot of litigation.
See, my recollection is that part of the impetus for this ordinance to begin with had to do with property owners allowing residential properties to deteriorate to the point where they were claiming that they were not salvageable, and then saying, okay, now we want to tear them down.
Well,
and this seems to continue that. If there's another mechanism for continuing to enforce some level of property maintenance, I would rather see that. Also, what definition, what finding would have to be made about public health and safety? I mean, public health, welfare, or safety seems pretty general, and then the following sentence says, this additional finding would allow for removal in the event a structure poses a hazard or a danger to the public. So I think that the definition there is even unclear. So if the property owner is just letting his building, go into ruin, I think we should use other means to enforce the maintenance of that property rather than saying, okay, just tear it down and leave it alone.
Well, I
Leave
think
it lot.
that's the decision made when the specific property comes up for approval by us or the city council. All this is doing is making a mechanism by which this hearing can be held.
I would point out that under the current ordinance, if you look at the draft ordinance itself on page 2 of 3, where you have the findings for approval, section 9-4.65.7, everything except D, which is underlined because it's new, All the rest of that is already in the zoning ordinance. And it, only finding A pertains to a replacement structure. If the city council currently may find that the building is irrevocably damaged due to a natural disaster, like an earthquake or a fire, flood, or whatever, or that the residential structure or lot is irrevocably contaminated with various toxins. So if either of those are the case, then the council can authorize the demolition prior to the replacement structure. But item D is a new one that is to address the issue of blight, really.
What is the additional finding that they have to make?
D.
This is the
The
only
best
thing
interest.
that's new.
That the demolition or removal of the structure is in the best interest of the public health, welfare, or safety.
Boy, that's a tough one.
Actually, though, the building code doesn't allow a demolition permit to be issued.
That's so.
Do we have a motion, or do
pretty
we wish to
vague.
discuss it further?
But there is actually a little subtle nuance to this, which is that under the way the building code is written, the building official still can't issue a demolition permit for the existing building until the building permit for the replacement building is ready to be issued, even if the council finds that it's damaged due to natural disaster or that's irrevocably contaminated. The building still has to stay there until the new building is ready to be
Oh.
built.
They can't tear it down.
Not the way the code is written now.
So a burned out structure could just sit there.
Right. This would allow, in the case where the city council finds that it's in the best interest of public health, safety, or welfare to remove it, this would allow the building official to issue that demolition permit.
I think we should allow ourselves a latitude of getting rid of dangerous. I move approval of the. What are we? Are we recommend?
Yeah, you're recommending, you're approving it and recommending that the city council adopt
I
it.
would make that motion.
I'll second that.
We have a vote on that?
All right. Commissioner Donaldson,
No.
Commissioner Coomerly,
No.
Commissioner Hoff,
Aye.
Commissioner Sherman,
Aye.
Commissioner Steinberg,
Aye.
and Vice Chair Cardoza.
Aye.
4 ayes, 2 noes. The motion is approved. We will forward this to the city council with your recommendation that it be adopted.
Do we have any commissioner comments?
I would just like to make one comment, that I want to thank my fellow commissioners for the privilege of having served as your chairman for a year. It was a tough battle. I even recall staying up till 2 o'clock in the morning, so I appreciate your cooperation, and I wish my successors all the luck in the world. Thank you.
I'd
Thank
like
you
to
for your service, Art.
welcome the two new commissioners, and look forward to working with you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Seeing no further comment, I declare the meeting adjourned.